My name is Mario, and I am 58 years old. For 30 years, I built my life inside a house that I constructed with my own two hands. Every nail, every beam, every coat of paint carried a piece of my soul. My wife Linda took her last breath in the upstairs bedroom, and my son Derek grew from a tiny infant into a grown man under that roof. 2 years ago, I signed over the deed to Derek, believing I was protecting our family legacy. He promised I would live there forever. But some promises, well, they crumble when money enters the picture. I never imagined that the boy I sacrificed everything for would one day charge me $1,700 a month to sleep in the room I painted myself. Before I continue, let me ask you something. Where are you watching from today? Drop your location in the comments below. And if you believe that gratitude should mean something in a family, go ahead and hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Because what I am about to tell you will make you rethink everything you thought you knew about the word family. I spent 35 years working as an industrial electrician at a steel manufacturing plant on the outskirts of Cleveland, Ohio. Every morning I woke up at 4:30, packed my lunch in a metal box that Linda had given me on our first anniversary, and drove 45 minutes through darkness to reach the factory gates before the 6 o'clock shift began. The work was brutal. 12-hour shifts were common, sometimes stretching into 16 when equipment failed or deadlines pressed against us like a weight we could not escape. Winter was the worst. I remember standing on scaffolding 30 feet above the ground, my fingers numb inside thick gloves, trying to repair electrical panels while snow fell sideways and the wind cut through every layer of clothing I wore. The burns on my hands came from hot wires and sparks that jumped without warning. I still carry the scars, faded white lines across my palms that tell the story of decades spent keeping machines running so other men could keep their jobs. But I never complained. Not once. Because every dollar I earned went straight into building a life for my family. Every paycheck meant food on the tablecloths on my son's back, and one step closer to finishing the house that became our home. That house was my greatest achievement outside of my family. I bought the land when I was 26 years old, using every penny I had saved from 5 years of working double shifts. The plot sat on a quiet street in a modest neighborhood, surrounded by oak trees that turned golden every autumn. I remember standing there on the day I signed the papers, looking at the empty lot and seeing not dirt and weeds, but a future. I built that house myself, mostly on weekends and holidays when the factory was closed. I dug the foundation with a shovel and my own back mixed concrete until my arms ached and laid every brick with hands that were already calloused from years of labor. Linda was pregnant with Derek during the final months of construction. I can still picture her sitting in a folding chair on the unfinished porch, her belly round beneath a blue sundress, watching me install the windows while she hummed songs to our unborn child. The night Derek was born, the house still did not have proper doors, just plastic sheets covering the openings to keep out the cold. But I brought my wife and newborn son home to that unfinished structure anyway, because it was ours. I remember holding Derek for the first time inside those bare walls, looking down at his tiny face and promising him that I would give him everything I never had. And I kept that promise. For the next 18 years, I worked harder than any man should have to work. I took night shifts so I could be home during the day to drive Derek to school and attend his baseball games. I sat in the bleachers with sawdust still in my hair, cheering until my voice went hoarse every time he stepped up to bat. When he decided he wanted to study real estate business at the state university, I picked up extra shifts for 4 straight years to cover the tuition. I never told him how tired I was, how some nights I fell asleep at the dinner table before I could finish eating. He did not need to carry that weight. That was my job as his father. Then came the darkness that changed everything. 7 years ago, Linda was diagnosed with stage 3 breast cancer. The doctor delivered the news in a small office with fluorescent lights that buzzed overhead, and I remember watching Linda's face as she absorbed the words. She did not cry. She just reached over and took my hand, squeezing it once, as if to tell me that we would face this together. 18 months. That is how long I had to say goodbye. I took early retirement from the factory to care for her at home, learning to do things I never imagined I would need to know. I learned to cook soft foods when she could not swallow solid meals. I learned to change bandages and administer medications through the night. I learned to hold her when the pain became too much and words were no longer enough. Linda passed away in the upstairs bedroom on a Tuesday morning in March. The window was open just a crack, letting in the smell of the hyacinths she had planted in the garden below. I was holding her hand when she took her last breath, and for a long time afterward I could not bring myself to close that window. It felt like closing the door on her forever. After Linda died, Derek was my anchor. He called every single day, sometimes twice. He drove down from Columbus every weekend to check on me, to sit with me on the porch, where his mother used to watch the sunset. We did not always talk. Sometimes we just sat in silence, two men grieving the same woman in our own private ways. But his presence meant everything. Then he met Heather. She was a marketing executive with sharp eyes and a sharper smile, and Derek fell for her completely. They married within a year, a small ceremony that Linda would have loved. I welcomed Heather into the family like a daughter, hoping she would become part of the fabric of our lives, the way Linda had been. But something shifted after the wedding. The daily calls became weekly, then monthly. The weekend visits grew shorter and less frequent. Derek always had excuses. Work was demanding. Heather needed him. Life was busy. I told myself this was normal, that children grow up and create their own lives. I tried not to feel the emptiness growing inside the house that once echoed with laughter and conversation. 2 years ago, Derek came to me with a proposal. He explained that transferring the house into his name would protect it from estate taxes and ensure that the property stayed in the family. He spoke with the confidence of a real estate professional, throwing around terms like asset protection and probate avoidance. I listened and nodded, understanding little but trusting completely. "You will live here forever, Dad," he said, placing his hand on my shoulder. "This is just paperwork. Nothing changes." I signed the documents without hesitation. This was my son, the boy I had carried on my shoulders through county fairs, the young man I had taught to drive in the empty parking lot behind the grocery store, the adult who had cried in my arms at his mother's funeral. Of course I trusted him. I did not know then that those signatures would cost me everything I had built. The changes started small, so small that I almost did not notice them at first. About 6 months after I signed over the deed, Derek stopped by on a Saturday afternoon. He walked through the garage with a critical eye, pointing at the shelves lined with tools and boxes that had accumulated over 3 decades. "Dad, I need to park my car in here when I visit," he said, his tone casual but firm. "Can you clear out some of this old stuff?" I looked at the shelves. There was the toolbox Linda had given me for my 40th birthday, the one with my initials engraved on the lid. There were boxes of Christmas decorations we had collected over the years, ornaments that Derek himself had made in elementary school. There were fishing rods and camping gear from trips we took as a family. Memories packed in cardboard and labeled with fading marker. But Derek needed space for his car. So I spent the following week sorting through 30 years of memories, deciding what to keep and what to discard. Some things went to donation centers. Others went to the trash. A few precious items I kept in my bedroom, hidden away like secrets I was ashamed to hold on to. Heather began appearing at the house more frequently, though never to visit me. She would arrive unannounced, walking through the rooms with her phone in hand, taking photographs of the walls and windows. I found her measuring the living room one afternoon, a tape measure stretched between her hands as she muttered numbers to herself. "Just thinking about some updates," she said when I asked. "This place could use a modern touch, do you not think?" I did not know how to answer. The house looked the same as it had for 30 years. The same cream-colored walls that Linda had chosen. The same hardwood floors I had installed myself. The same kitchen where we had shared thousands of meals as a family. I did not see anything that needed updating, but I held my tongue. Then came the dinner that changed the atmosphere entirely. Derek and Heather arrived on a Friday evening with a bottle of wine and takeout containers from an expensive restaurant. We sat at the dining table, the same table where Derek had done his homework as a child, and made small talk about weather and work and nothing of substance. Halfway through the meal, Derek cleared his throat. "Dad, we need to talk about the house expenses." I set down my fork, a knot forming in my stomach. "Property taxes went up this year," he continued, not meeting my eyes. "And maintenance costs are adding up. The roof needs attention, the furnace is old, and there are a dozen other things that need fixing." "I understand," I said slowly. "What are you thinking?" "We think it is fair if you contribute to the monthly costs. $500 should cover your share." $500. My retirement income was $2,300 a month. After paying for groceries, medications, and the small pleasures that made life bearable, there was not much left. But this was my son asking, and the request seemed reasonable enough. "All right," I agreed. $500 a month. I can manage that." Heather smiled, but there was something behind that smile I could not name. Something cold. The next blow came without warning. I had a routine checkup at the doctor's office, nothing serious, just the usual tests that come with being a man pushing 60. When I returned home that afternoon, I noticed immediately that something was different. The door to Linda's room, the room I had kept exactly as she left it, was open. I walked upstairs with a growing sense of dread. When I reached the doorway, I stopped. The room was empty. Completely empty. Linda's clothes were gone from the closet. Her books were missing from the shelves. Her perfume bottles, her jewelry box, her reading glasses that I had left on the nightstand because I could not bear to move them. All of it vanished. Heather appeared behind me, her voice light and casual. "I am turning this into a home office. The clutter had to go." Clutter. She called my wife's belongings clutter. I wanted to scream. I wanted to demand that she return everything, that she put back every single item exactly where it belonged. But the words caught in my throat, trapped behind a wall of shock and grief that I could not break through. I stood there in the empty doorway, breathing in air that no longer carried Linda's scent, and felt a piece of myself disappear along with her things. From that day forward, Derek's calls became rare. When I tried to reach him, he was always busy, always promising to call back, but never following through. The few times we did speak, the conversations were brief and distant, filled with awkward silences and forced pleasantries. I barely recognized the voice on the other end of the line. It did not sound like my son. The dinners we shared grew tense. Heather dominated every conversation, steering topics toward money and expenses and the burden of maintaining an old house. Derek sat beside her, nodding along, offering no defense when she made comments about how much easier things would be if they could rent out the property. I sat across from them, feeling less like the man who built this home and more like an unwanted guest who had overstayed his welcome. I tried to convince myself that this was temporary. Derek was under pressure, caught between his wife's expectations and his father's presence. Things would improve. They had to improve. Because the alternative, the idea that my own son had become a stranger who saw me as an obstacle rather than a parent, was too painful to accept. But deep inside, in the quiet moments when I sat alone in my small room at the corner of the house, I knew something fundamental had changed. The warmth that once filled these walls had been replaced by something cold and transactional, and I did not know how to bring the warmth back. 3 months after that first conversation about expenses, Derek sat me down again. This time there was no dinner, no pretense of a casual visit. He arrived on a Tuesday evening with a folder tucked under his arm and Heather waiting in the car outside. "Dad, we need to revisit our arrangement," he said, spreading papers across the kitchen counter. Charts and numbers covered the pages, all printed in neat columns that meant nothing to me. 500 is not enough, he continued, pointing at figures I could not interpret. Between taxes, insurance, utilities, and maintenance reserves, the actual cost of keeping this property running is much higher than I anticipated. We need you to contribute $1,200 a month. $1,200. That was more than half my retirement income. I would have barely enough left for food and medicine, nothing for the small comforts that made solitude bearable. "Derek, I cannot afford that," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the panic rising in my chest. "My pension is fixed. There is no extra money coming in." He shrugged, a gesture so casual it felt like a slap. "Then maybe you could find some part-time work, or sell some of your things. That furniture in the basement must be worth something." The furniture in the basement. My father's oak desk, the one he built with his own hands and passed down to me. The rocking chair where Linda nursed Derek as an infant. The cedar chest where I kept letters and photographs from our courtship. My son was suggesting I sell my family's history to pay rent in my own home. I agreed to the increase because I did not know what else to do. I started skipping meals to save money, eating 1 full meal a day instead of 3. I canceled the newspaper subscription I had kept for 20 years. I stopped buying new clothes, wearing the same faded shirts and patched trousers until they threatened to fall apart. But the financial pressure was not the worst part. Heather began implementing rules that made me feel like a prisoner in my own house. "No cooking after 7 in the evening," she announced one day. "The smell lingers, and it bothers me when I stay over." "No visitors without prior approval," she added later. "We cannot have strangers coming in and out of our property." "The living room is off limits on weekends," she declared finally. "Derek and I need private space when we visit." Our property. Private space. The words cut deeper than any financial demand. I was being erased from my own home, pushed into smaller and smaller corners, until I occupied nothing but a single room that had once been a storage closet. I ate my meals in that room, watched television on a small screen I had bought decades ago, and spent my evenings staring at walls that seemed to close in a little more each day. The isolation was crushing. I stopped calling friends because I was embarrassed to invite them over and unable to visit them without transportation. I stopped attending the church services Linda and I had enjoyed together because I could not bear the sympathetic looks and whispered questions about how I was managing alone. I stopped doing almost everything that connected me to the outside world, retreating into a solitude that felt more like a sentence than a choice. One afternoon, I came home from a walk around the block to find Derek and Heather in the kitchen, their voices low and conspiratorial. I paused in the hallway out of sight and listened. What I heard made my blood run cold. "The market value is around $350,000, Derek was saying. "If we rent it out, we can easily get $3,500 a month. Maybe more with some cosmetic updates." But what about your father? Heather asked, though her tone suggested the question was purely rhetorical. Derek laughed softly. We just keep raising the rent until he cannot afford to stay. He will leave on his own. No need for any ugly confrontation. No lawyers, no drama. He will just decide it is easier to go. No ugly confrontation. No drama. As if disposing of your father was simply a matter of strategic pricing, like adjusting the cost of merchandise that was not moving fast enough. I stood frozen in the hallway, my hand pressed against the wall for support. The son I had raised the boy I had worked myself to exhaustion, for the man I had trusted with my home and my future, was planning to push me out through financial pressure. And he was discussing it with his wife, like it was nothing more than a business strategy. That night, I confronted him. I waited until Heather left the room, then asked Derek directly about what I had overheard. He did not deny it. He did not apologize. He simply looked at me with eyes that held no warmth and explained that this was a logical decision. The house is in my name now, he said, as if stating an obvious fact. That makes it my asset. I have to manage it responsibly. You living here for free does not make financial sense, Dad. Surely you can understand that. For free. As if I had not built every inch of this structure with my own labor. As if I had not poured my savings, my sweat, my years into creating the home where he had grown up safe and loved. As if the decades of sacrifice meant nothing against the cold calculation of monthly cash flow. I built this house, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. Derek shook his head slowly. You did, and then you gave it to me. The paperwork is clear, Dad. This is not your house anymore. It is mine. I did not sleep that night. I lay awake, staring at the ceiling I had painted myself. Remembering the summer I spent up on a ladder, rolling white latex over bare plaster while Linda handed me supplies from below. I remembered her singing along to the radio, remembered Derek as a toddler playing with blocks on the tarp-covered floor, remembered the feeling of building something that would outlast me. And I wondered somewhere in those dark hours where I had gone wrong. What had I done or failed to do that turned my son into a man who could treat his own father like a liability to be managed? The official notice arrived exactly 1 week later. Derek did not deliver it himself. He sent it through certified mail as if I were a stranger rather than his father, as if our relationship required legal documentation instead of conversation. I held the envelope in my hands for a long time before opening it. My name was printed in the address window, formal and impersonal. The return address listed a law office I did not recognize. Whatever was inside, I knew it would not bring good news. The letter was 2 pages long, filled with legal language and formal phrases that seemed designed to obscure rather than clarify. But the core message was brutally simple. Effective the first day of the following month, the rent for my residence would be set at $1,700 per month. Failure to pay would result in a 30-day notice to vacate. The document included Derek's signature at the bottom, notarized and official as binding as any contract between strangers. $1,700. More than 70% of my monthly income. An amount so impossible that it might as well have been $1 million. This was not a rental agreement. This was an eviction notice dressed in formal clothing. I called Derek immediately, my hands trembling as I held the phone. He answered on the 4th ring, his voice flat and neutral. I got your letter, I said, struggling to keep my composure. I know, Dad. Heather and I discussed it extensively. That is the fair market rate for a room in this area. We cannot keep subsidizing your living expenses indefinitely. Subsidizing. As if every sacrifice I had made for him counted for nothing. As if the years of exhaustion and the missed opportunities and the constant struggle to provide were entries in a ledger that had already been balanced and closed. "Derek, please," I said, abandoning any pretense of dignity. "I am your father. I worked my entire life to give you everything you needed. I paid for your education. I supported your dreams. I was there for every important moment. Does none of that matter to you?" The silence on the other end stretched for several seconds. When Derek finally spoke, his words were careful and measured, as if he had rehearsed them. "That was the past, Dad. Things are different now. You need to accept reality and make decisions based on your current situation, not what happened 20 or 30 years ago." Then he hung up, and I was left holding a dead phone in a house that no longer felt like home. The first day of the month arrived, and Heather came to collect the rent. She stood in the doorway of my room, a leather folder in one hand and a pen in the other, looking at me with the same expression a landlord might give a tenant who was late on payment. "Do you have the check?" she asked. "I do not have $1,700, I replied. "You know I cannot afford that." She clicked her tongue, a sound of manufactured disappointment. "That is unfortunate. You know there are facilities that specialize in caring for elderly people who cannot manage on their own. Nursing homes, assisted living centers. They are quite affordable, really, and you would have people to look after you. Probably better than struggling alone in a room you cannot afford." Nursing homes, assisted living centers. She was suggesting I be warehoused somewhere removed from sight, like inconvenient furniture, while she and Derek converted my life's work into rental income. This was the woman I had welcomed into my family. The woman I had embraced at her wedding, telling her I was grateful my son had found someone to share his life with. The woman I had hoped would become like a daughter, filling some small part of the void Linda had left behind. And now she stood before me suggesting I be institutionalized so they could profit from my displacement. I could not speak. I could not form words to respond to such casual cruelty. I just stood there looking at this stranger who had somehow infiltrated my family and turned my son against me. The following day, I discovered that Linda's rocking chair was gone. It had sat in the corner of the living room for 23 years. The chair where she nursed our infant son, where she read books on quiet evenings, where she sat during her final months when she still had the strength to come downstairs. I had kept it exactly where she left it, a small monument to her presence in our home. I found Derek in the kitchen and asked what had happened to the chair. "Heather sold it online," he said, not looking up from his phone. "It was old, and it did not match the aesthetic we are going for. Got $200 for it, which is not bad for used furniture." $200. The chair where his mother had rocked him to sleep as a baby. The chair where she had read him bedtime stories and comforted him after nightmares. The chair that held decades of love and memory and meaning, sold to a stranger for $200. Something broke inside me in that moment. Not dramatically, not with tears or shouting, just a quiet internal collapse like a wall that had been crumbling for months, finally giving way. I understood with terrible clarity that there was nothing left to save here. The son I had raised no longer existed, replaced by someone I did not recognize. The house I had built was no longer my home, just a structure that others controlled. Everything I had worked for, sacrificed for, believed in, had been stripped away while I stood by and watched. That night, I made my decision. I packed a single suitcase with clothes, medications, and the few personal items I could not bear to leave behind. I took the small framed photograph of Linda that had sat on my nightstand since she died. I took the letters she wrote me when we were young and in love. I took the pocket watch my father gave me on my wedding day. In the morning before Derek or Heather arrived, I walked out of the house I had built with my own hands. I did not leave a note. I did not say goodbye. I simply closed the door behind me, feeling the weight of 3 decades lifting from my shoulders and crashing down on my heart simultaneously. I turned back once to look at the house. The oak tree I had planted when Derek was born had grown tall and strong, its branches reaching toward the sky. The garden where Linda had grown her flowers was now a paved parking area. The windows I had installed myself reflected the early morning sun, anonymous and indifferent. This was no longer my home. Perhaps it had stopped being my home long before I finally walked away. I had just been too stubborn, too hopeful, too desperate to believe in my son's goodness to see the truth. Now I saw it clearly, and I chose to leave. The apartment I found was small, a 1-bedroom unit on the 3rd floor of a modest building in a neighborhood I had never visited before. The walls were thin, the carpet was worn, and the kitchen consisted of a 2-burner stove and a refrigerator that hummed loudly through the night. But it was mine, paid for with my own money, and nobody could set rules about when I could cook or whom I could invite inside. The first weeks were difficult in ways I had not anticipated. I woke each morning disoriented, reaching for a nightstand that was not there, listening for sounds of a house that no longer existed in my life. The silence was different here, not the comfortable quiet of a home I knew intimately, but the unfamiliar stillness of a place where I was a stranger. I barely left the apartment during those initial days. I lay on the narrow bed and stared at water stains on the ceiling, replaying conversations in my mind, searching for the moment when everything went wrong. Had I been too generous with Derek? Had I failed to teach him gratitude? Had Linda's death changed him in ways I did not recognize until it was too late? The questions circled endlessly, offering no answers, only more pain. Then one morning I forced myself to walk outside. The apartment felt like a cage, and I needed air movement, something to break the cycle of rumination. I wandered without destination until I found a small coffee shop on a corner 2 blocks away. The sign was faded, and the windows were cluttered with flyers for local events, but the smell of fresh coffee drew me inside. I ordered a cup and sat at a table near the window, watching people pass by on the sidewalk. And then I heard a voice I had not heard in over 5 years. "Mario, is that you?" I looked up to see Frank Kowalski standing beside my table, a paper cup in his hand, and an expression of genuine surprise on his weathered face. Frank and I had worked together at the steel plant for nearly 20 years before he retired and moved to Florida. Or so I had thought. "Frank," I said, rising to shake his hand. "I thought you were living down south." He laughed and pulled out the chair across from me. "Tried it for 2 years. Too hot, too humid, too many people trying to sell me timeshares. Came back to Ohio where I belong. What about you? What brings you to this part of town?" I did not intend to tell him everything. I planned to offer some vague explanation about downsizing, about wanting a change of scenery. But sitting there with my old friend, someone who had known me during the years when Linda was alive and Derek was still a child, I found myself unable to maintain the pretense. The story poured out of me, every detail, every humiliation, every moment of betrayal. Frank listened without interrupting his expression, shifting from surprise to anger to something that looked like recognition. "I know that story," he said when I finished. "Different details, same pain. My daughter tried something similar after my divorce. Thought she could pressure me into signing over my savings by making my life miserable. Some children, they see their parents not as people but as resources to be extracted. It was the first time someone had validated what I had experienced. The first time someone acknowledged that what Derek did was wrong, not just unfortunate. I felt something loosen in my chest, a knot I had not even realized was there. Frank insisted on introducing me to a group of men who met every Tuesday at the community center downtown. "Nothing fancy," he explained. "Just a bunch of guys our age, most of us dealing with one kind of loss or another. We fix things, play cards, complain about the world. It helps." I went reluctantly, expecting awkwardness and forced conversation. Instead, I found a room full of men who understood loneliness and disappointment without needing lengthy explanations. Walter, the group's unofficial leader, ran a small electronics repair shop and invited me to help out a few days a week when he heard about my background. George had lost his wife to Alzheimer's and his children to indifference. Thomas had survived a corporate bankruptcy and rebuilt his life at 62. Each of them carried scars, but they wore them openly without shame. I started working at Walter's shop not for the money, which was modest, but for the purpose it gave my days. There was satisfaction in diagnosing a problem, finding the fault in a circuit-restoring function to something that had been discarded as broken. I had spent my life fixing things. I had forgotten how good it felt. Slowly, the apartment began to feel less like exile and more like home. I bought a few plants for the windowsill, remembering how Linda had loved her garden. I started cooking again, experimenting with recipes she had taught me and some new ones I found in library books. I reconnected with friends from the plant I had lost touch with over the years, calling them on Sunday evenings to catch up on their lives and share fragments of my own. One evening, sitting on the small balcony with a cup of tea, I realized I had gone an entire day without thinking about Derek or the house. The realization startled me. For so long, those thoughts had been my constant companions, a weight I carried from waking to sleep. Now somehow they had begun to fade, not disappearing entirely, but moving to a distance where they no longer dominated every moment. I was not healed. That would take more time, perhaps more than I had left. But I was no longer drowning. I had found solid ground beneath my feet, and I was learning to stand again. 6 months after I left the house, I received a phone call from Margaret Thompson, my neighbor from the old street. We had not spoken since my departure, though she had tried to reach me several times. I had avoided the calls, not wanting to hear news from a place I was trying to forget. This time I answered. "Mario, I thought you should know what is happening over here," she said, her voice carrying that particular tone of someone delivering news they take no pleasure in sharing. The house was falling apart. Margaret described electrical problems that caused lights to flicker and outlets to spark dangerously. Water had begun seeping into the basement from pipes that had started to leak. The roof, which I had patched and maintained for decades, had developed multiple leaks after a severe storm, and water damage was spreading across the upstairs ceilings. "They have had contractors in and out for weeks," Margaret continued. "But nobody can figure out the wiring. You did it all yourself, and apparently it is too customized for anyone else to understand without tearing out the walls." I thanked her for the information and ended the call unsure how to feel. Part of me, a part I was not proud of, felt a grim satisfaction. Derek had taken my home and now discovered that the home required knowledge he did not possess and could not easily purchase. Another part felt sadness, thinking of the structure I had built deteriorating while strangers struggled to understand its systems. A week later, Derek called. It was the first time I had heard from him since I left 6 months of silence broken by a number I almost did not recognize flashing on my phone. "Dad," he said, his voice lacking the cold confidence I remembered. "We need to talk. About the house." "I am listening," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. He explained the problems, though Margaret had already told me most of it. Repair estimates were climbing into the tens of thousands. The contractors said the electrical system was so unconventional, they would need to essentially rewire the entire structure. Potential renters had toured the property, but declined after seeing the extent of the issues. I was thinking, Derek continued, and I could hear the discomfort in his words, that maybe you could come back and help sort this out. You know the house better than anyone, and in exchange we could forget about the rent entirely. You could stay for free like before. Like before. As if the months of humiliation could be erased with a simple offer. I did not respond immediately. I let the silence stretch, giving myself time to think clearly rather than react from emotion. I will consider it, I finally said. But this is not a phone conversation. If you want to discuss this, we meet in person. We arranged to meet at a coffee shop, halfway between my apartment and the old neighborhood neutral territory, where neither of us would have advantage. Derek agreed quickly, perhaps too quickly, and I spent the following days preparing myself for an encounter I was not certain I wanted. I arrived early and chose a table near the back, away from windows and other customers. Derek came with Heather, both of them looking more worn than I remembered. Dark circles under their eyes, tension visible in the way they held themselves. The stress of the past months had taken its toll. Derek laid out the situation in detail. The repair bills, the lost rental income, the mounting pressure of mortgage payments he had taken out against the property's value. Heather sat silently beside him, her earlier arrogance replaced by something that might have been anxiety. So you see, Dad, Derek concluded, it really would help everyone if you came back. You fix what needs fixing, we do not charge rent, everything goes back to the way it was. I took a slow sip of my coffee, organizing my thoughts before speaking. Let me make sure I understand, I said calmly. You want me to return to the house I built, the home where I lived for 30 years, the property you legally took from me. You want me to use my skills to repair damage that accumulated, because nobody else understands the systems I created. And in exchange for my labor and expertise, you will graciously allow me to live there without paying rent that I could never have afforded anyway. Derek shifted uncomfortably. Well, when you put it that way, it sounds like exactly what it is, I interrupted. You stripped me of my home, my dignity, and my relationship with my only son. You and your wife treated me like an unwanted tenant, suggested I belonged in a nursing home, and sold your mother's belongings for pocket change. Now that your investment has turned into a liability, you want me to bail you out? Heather started to speak, but I held up my hand. I am not finished. I want you both to understand something. That house was built with love. Every board, every wire, every nail was placed by hands that cared about creating a home, not a revenue stream. Your mother and I poured ourselves into that structure, and then we poured ourselves into raising you within its walls. It was never about the property value or the market rate. It was about family. I looked directly at Derek, holding his gaze. You chose to see that house as an asset to be monetized. You chose to see me as an obstacle to your financial goals. Those were your choices, and now you are living with the consequences. That is how life works. Actions have results, and not all results can be fixed by calling your father. Dad, please, Derek said, and for a moment I heard something of the boy he used to be, uncertain and reaching for reassurance. I made mistakes. I know that now. But can we not find a way forward? I considered his words carefully. There was no magic in forgiveness, no instant erasure of wounds. But there was also no future in carrying bitterness like a stone around my neck. I am not going back to that house, I said finally. I have built a new life, small but mine, and I will not abandon it to rescue a property that is no longer my concern. You own that house now. You manage its problems. That is what ownership means. I reached into my pocket, and withdrew several folded bills enough to cover my coffee and theirs. But I will tell you this. I do not hate you, Derek. I am disappointed in ways I cannot fully express, and I am hurt in ways that may never fully heal. But you are still my son. The door to a relationship is not permanently closed. However, that door will only open if you walk through it honestly, without asking for anything except a chance to be family again. No house, no money, no favors. Just a son who wants his father in his life. I stood and placed the money on the table. You have my number. Use it when you are ready to have that conversation. Not before. Then I walked out of the coffee shop, leaving them sitting there with their problems and their choices. I did not look back to see their reactions. It no longer mattered what they decided. I had said what I needed to say, and the rest was up to them. The walk home felt different than any walk I had taken since leaving the house. My steps were lighter, my breathing easier. Something had been released in that conversation, some burden I had not realized I was still carrying. I had not forgiven Derek, not completely, and I had not forgotten what he did. But I had freed myself from the need for his acknowledgement, his apology, his approval. I was my own man living my own life, and that after everything was enough. A year has passed since that meeting in the coffee shop. I am 59 now, closer to 60 than I like to admit, but feeling more alive than I have in decades. The small apartment that once seemed like a prison has become a sanctuary filled with books and plants, and the comfortable disorder of a life lived on my own terms. I still work at Walter's shop 3 days a week. We have become partners of a sort, splitting the modest profits and sharing the satisfaction of bringing broken things back to life. Last month, we took on an apprentice, a young man named Daniel, who reminds me of Derek at that age, eager and earnest, and not yet hardened by the world. I find myself teaching him not just electrical work, but something about patience and craftsmanship lessons I wish I had taught my own son more effectively. The Tuesday group continues to meet at the community center, though the membership has shifted over time. George passed away in the spring quietly and surrounded by his newfound friends, which is more than his biological family gave him. Thomas got remarried to a woman he met at a pottery class, and now he shows up with clay stains on his shirts and a grin that makes him look 20 years younger. New faces appear, men seeking the same fellowship that saved me, and I try to offer them what Frank offered me, a listening ear and the assurance that they are not alone. Derek has called twice since our meeting. The first call came 3 months later, a brief and awkward conversation where he updated me on the house situation. He had sold it finally at a significant loss, unable to afford the repairs or find tenants willing to accept the property's condition. He and Heather had moved to a smaller place, their grand plans of real estate wealth reduced to the ordinary struggle of making mortgage payments on a modest home. The second call came last month. It was longer, more tentative. Derek spoke about regrets without quite apologizing, about realizing too late what he had thrown away. He asked if we might meet sometime just to talk, no agenda or expectations. I told him I would think about it, and I am still thinking. I have not forgiven him. I am not sure I know how or if forgiveness is even the right concept for what happened between us. But I have let go of the anger that used to keep me awake at night. I have accepted that my son became someone I do not fully understand and that I may never understand. I have mourned not just my wife, but the relationship I thought I had with my child, the future I imagined for our family that will never come to pass. What remains is not bitterness, but something quieter. Sadness, perhaps. Acceptance. A recognition that love does not guarantee reciprocity, and that the best we can do sometimes is love fully and then let go when that love is not returned. Linda would understand. She always knew that holding grudges was like drinking poison and expecting someone else to suffer. She released hurts, quickly moved forward with grace, focused on what remained rather than what was lost. I am trying to learn from her example even now, 7 years after she left this world. Some evenings I sit on the balcony with her photograph in my hand, telling her about my day. I describe the repairs I made at the shop, the conversations with my friends, the small adventures of a life rebuilt from ruins. I like to think she can hear me somehow, that some part of her is proud of the man I have become in her absence. And I think about the house sometimes, not with longing or regret, but with a kind of distant wonder. I built that house with my own hands when I was young and strong and full of belief in the future. I raised my son there, loved my wife there, created a life there. And then I walked away from it, leaving behind not just walls and wires, but decades of memories embedded in every room. The house belongs to strangers now. They are probably renovating, tearing out the systems I designed, and replacing them with something standard and comprehensible. They are painting over the walls Linda chose, ripping up the floors I laid, erasing the physical evidence that we ever existed there. In a few years, nothing of us will remain except perhaps the foundation I poured, with my own concrete mixer, the bones beneath the surface that no renovation can reach. That is fine. That is how life works. We build, we inhabit, we leave, and others come after us to build again. The house was never meant to last forever, no more than I am. What matters is not the permanence of the structure, but the love that filled it while we were there. And love, unlike houses, cannot be taken away. It cannot be signed over or sold or demolished. It lives in memory in the hearts of those who gave and received it, in the invisible threads that connect us to everyone we have ever cared for. Derek may have taken my house, but he could not take Linda from my heart, or the years of happiness we shared, or the man I became through loving and losing her. I learned something in this past year, something I wish I had understood decades ago. Home is not a building. Home is not walls or windows or a name on a deed. Home is the place where you are known and accepted, where you can be yourself without pretense, where love is given freely and received with gratitude. That kind of home cannot be bought or built or inherited. It can only be created moment by moment through the choices we make about who we let into our lives. My home now is small. A rented apartment, a repair shop, a circle of friends who understand solitude and have chosen connection anyway. It is not what I imagined when I was young and building my first house with dreams of grandchildren playing in the yard. But it is enough. It is more than enough. It is mine. If you are watching this and going through something similar, if someone you trusted has betrayed you, if the life you built has crumbled and you are standing in the ruins wondering how to begin again, let me tell you what I have learned. You have permission to leave. You have permission to walk away from places and people that no longer serve your well-being, even if they once meant everything to you. You have permission to grieve what is lost, and then when you are ready to build something new. You are not too old, not too tired, not too damaged. You are exactly where you need to be to begin. And if the people who hurt you ever come back asking for forgiveness or help or another chance, you have permission to decide what you are willing to give. Forgiveness is not an obligation. Reconciliation is not required. The only thing you owe is honesty with them and with yourself about what you can and cannot accept. My son set my rent at $1,700 to live in what was once my own house. I moved out. And then slowly, painfully, beautifully, I discovered that losing that house was not the end of my story. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one I never expected to write. So I ask you now, watching this video, wherever you are in the world, what chapter are you ready to begin? What are you holding on to that you might need to release? and what might be waiting for you on the other side of letting go. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let me know if this story touched something in you, if it reminded you of your own experiences, if it gave you hope or made you think. Hit that like button if you believe that dignity matters more than property, and subscribe to this channel if you want to hear more stories about ordinary people finding their way through extraordinary pain. Thank you for listening to an old man talk about his life. Thank you for giving me your time and your attention. I do not know who you are or what struggles you carry, but I hope you find your way to peace. I hope you find people who value you for who you are, not what you can give them. I hope you build a home wherever and however that home takes shape, filled with the love you deserve. Take care of yourselves out there. And remember, it is never too late to start over. Never.